Welcome to History 2323, a lecture on the Vietnam War. In the introduction, you can see that this war lasted basically 1950 to 1975. It involved 6 presidents, first TV war, one that splits the nation in half. It's our second limited war after Korea, and it's the first one that the U.S. military will not be victorious in. The objectives for the U.S. South Vietnam, you can read those, as well as for North Vietnam. The strategies, U.S. South Vietnam, and Dien is North Vietnam. The difference between those, as you can see, they're polar opposites, will lead to low-intensive, long-lasting conflict. More introduction here. You can see the stats. I wouldn't memorize any of them, but just to give you an idea of how many Americans died, were wounded, etc., versus the Vietnamese. That's going to be on both sides of the war. Geography: Vietnam is long and skinny, basically from Chicago down to Florida would be a way of the length of it. It's very rich in rice production. It's got 2 population centers around 2 major rivers. In the north, it will be Red River. In the south, the Mekong River. Those are where the rice growing regions are. Most of the interior of Vietnam is tropical jungle, and that leads to all kinds of complications when you're fighting a war. Also in the middle of the country are the Aboriginal people of Vietnam, which are called Montagnards, or the French refer to them as that. There's 30 tribes that live there, and for the most part they will be fighting with the U.S. and or with the South Vietnamese army. Vietnam is in the news quite often. You'll still hear references to, trade now has started with President Clinton. Diplomatic ties started with President Clinton after a 20-year of no contact. Still are looking for missing Americans. You'll hear stories about that occasionally. And then a lot of books, movies, TV shows have been made about the war. Okay, the war is broken into two parts. The first is called the First Indochinese War. It will go from 46 to 54. The same day that Japan surrenders to the Allied forces on September 2nd, 1945, Ho Chi Minh will declare independence for Vietnam. The French, however, decide they want to try to re-establish control of Vietnam, and so they will re-enter the picture. In 1946, a war will erupt, and the Ho Chi Minh will be the political leader, and General Vo Nguyen Giap will be the military leader of the Viet Minh. Eventually, that will become the North Vietnamese army. The French do poorly the first 4 years to 1950, and because we need a strong France in Europe, the U.S. decides it's in our interest to send in aid and then advisors to help the French. The French also try to unify the Vietnamese people around an emperor named Bao Dai, who really was under the thumb of the French. The war continues to go poorly. Again, the U.S. is now helping in Ernest, paying more than half of the war costs for the French. There's a strong belief in the domino theory, which is the idea of if one country goes communist, the countries around it will also go communist. The grand French finale will be called the Navarre Plan. It was trying to lure General Vo's forces, the Viet Minh forces, into the open so that they could be bombed at a place called Dinh Bien Phu. However, the Viet Minh were able to surround that French military installation and eventually, through a siege, will bring it to will defeat the French there at that location. That will result in a Geneva Conference, peace conference, which will split Vietnam temporarily in half. Promised to have elections in 2 years, and then gave a 300-day window for refugees to move to which others they wanted to go to the north part of the country, the communist part, or the south. But that event will conclude the First Indochinese War. The second one will be what we know in America as the Vietnam War. So because the elections, if they were held, that were set up by the Geneva Conference, they would most likely be won by Ho Chi Minh, the communists. The U.S. decides to find a political alternative in the south, and he was Ngo Dinh Diem. You can see the S for the south and for the north. His army is called ARVN. That's going to be an American-trained army. It's the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Whereas the Viet Minh then becomes a North Vietnamese army. In the south, they became the National Liberation Front, or the VC. There was an alliance set up. Now, South Vietnam could not be part of the alliance per se, but SEATO forces, which would be from Korea, the Philippines, elsewhere in Southeast Asia, will participate. I should mention also Australia, New Zealand. They also sent troops in with the U.S. in this, in what will emerge shortly as the Second Indochinese War. We're officially just advisors there, but there will be Americans already dying in small gun battles from the mid-1950s on. Ngo Dinh Diem's family, his brother causes some issues with mistreatment of Buddhists that will lead to an uprising. Eventually, JFK will give the green light to have Ngo and his brother Nhu removed from power. That led to actually their murders, their killings by their own military, and that is the date it happened on, November 1st, 63, and then if you can remember that JFK is going to be assassinated just a short time later, 3 weeks later. So Lyndon Johnson is now president. He's going to be running for re-election in November of 64. In the summer of 64, you will have what is called the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which is going to be described again in your notes. And a couple of American ships are involved. There's an attack on the 2nd of August and then an attack on the 4th of August. And those, based on that second attack, you will have a resolution passed Congress. You can see the vote total there, and the Senate, both House and Senate. Only 2 senators who vote against it are named. And that will give Johnson a green light. Now, he'll still be running for president. It'll be a green light to wage an undeclared war after he wins re-election. So Johnson will defeat Goldwater in 64. In November, by December, he is already beginning a bombing campaign in Laos, a bordering country of Vietnam. And then in March of the next year, he will begin a bombing campaign that will basically last throughout the whole war. It was called Operation Rolling Thunder. This phase is called the Americanization phase because Johnson will turn the Americans will take over the war. So you'll have troops land in March as well that same year, and there'll be 100,000 American troops there by July. The top commander for the first 4 years is Westmoreland. The first major battle is called the Battle of Ia Drang, which lasts, you can see the dates there, but the last few days of it are portrayed in the We Were Soldiers movie, if you've ever seen that. That's a major battle. Most battles after this will be small scale because the Americans have superior firepower. Now, the turning point of the war will come in 3 years later, 68. The President Johnson has been proclaiming that we're winning, successes or the victory is just around the corner, and so he is expecting the U.S. military to prevail. But in a move of deception, you will have General Vo Nguyen Giap pull troops into a little corner of South Vietnam called Khe Sanh. American troops were stationed there. They basically make it, it was like a little bit like at Dien Bien Phu, that earlier battle that the French lost. And then during Tet time, which is the holidays, it's Christmas, Easter, 4th of July, everything rolled up into one for Asians, and the Vietnamese generally took a holiday. It was like a ceasefire during a 2-week period to celebrate the Lunar New Year. During this time, though, when everything is scaled back in the south, the North Vietnamese will launch an incredible array of attacks throughout South Vietnam. And what this does is open up a credibility gap. American public begins to not trust what Lyndon Johnson is saying, and his popularity goes down, along with the popularity of the war. The Hue Massacre and My Lai Massacre, I'll let you just read that in your notes. The impact of the Tet Offensive politically is immense, because at the end of March of that same year, Johnson will announce he will not run for re-election. So this will lead to a chaotic summer for the Democratic Party, and out of that we'll have a new election in November of '68 with Richard Nixon. He will promise Vietnamization, which means turn the war over to the Vietnamese, and peace with honor. That will happen. Nixon wins the election, and the war will continue. You also will have peace talks in Paris going on. One of his controversial moves will be an invasion of Cambodia, which was a neutral state. This will lead to more protests, especially one in Kent State where there were 4 students killed. Also, there will be the publication of the Pentagon Papers, which will show that the U.S. presidents had been not totally telling the truth about what was going on in the war. That's just going to be with Daniel Ellsberg, be the one who gave the papers, their top secret, to the New York Times. ARVN is continue to be trained under Vietnamization, and it does do really well in the '72 offensive. Nixon also puts pressure in late '72 during the Christmas period to bring North Vietnam to the peace table, and that will be an intense 13 days of bombing. That will lead to a peace accord, the ceasefire in January, Operation Homecoming, American prisoners come home, and we will continue just as a U.S. troops stay there as advisory only for the most part, and ARVN will be doing the fighting. In early '75, you'll have another major invasion of the South by the North, and that will lead to the defeat of South Vietnam in late April of 1975. There'll be more to read about the legacies and so on in your textbook, as well as in your lecture outline notes. This concludes the Vietnam War lecture.